Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the English class. Fairy tales. Do you all like fairy tales? What is a fairy tale? Fairy tales are stories of magic and wonder that often involve magical creatures such as witches, giants, elves, and fairies. In our daily life, we are helped by a lot of people, animals, and other things. And do you like to help them back? Do you know any fairy tale character who likes to help others? I'm sure all of you have heard the story of Cinderella. In Cinderella's story, Cinderella's fairy godmother helps her to get to the ball. So today, we'll be reading a story about some magical creatures called elves who likes to help people. And elves are small, human-like, supernatural creatures described in folk tales, and they have pointed ears and magical powers. So today we are going to read a popular fairy tale called The Elves and the Shoemaker, and this was adapted from the original story by Brothers Grimm. Brothers Grimm, who are Jacob Ludwig Karl Grimm and Wilhelm Karl Grimm, were one of the first and the best known collectors of German and European folk tales. And they also played an important role in popularizing stories such as Cinderella, The Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, and so on. So today we are going to read the story, The Elves and the Shoemaker. All of you please take your English reader and turn to page number 79. Let's read the story. Once upon a time, there lived a poor shoemaker. Though he was honest and hardworking, he never made enough money. He and his wife ran the household with great difficulty. Sometimes all they had to eat was a piece of bread. The shoemaker saved some money and finally had enough to buy a piece of leather. He could make only one pair of shoes with it. So once there lived a poor shoemaker with his wife. They were so poor that most of the days they didn't have enough money for food. On some days, they only had just a piece of bread to eat. Even though the shoemaker was honest and hardworking, he never earned enough money to flourish his business or become richer. So somehow he managed to save some money and he bought a piece of leather, just enough to make just a pair of shoes. Let's see what happens next. He decided to make the shoes the next day. So he prepared the leather that night and left it ready on the table of his workroom. So what happened? He bought this piece of leather which is just enough to make one pair of shoes, and he made all the preparations in the night so that he can start making the shoes the next morning. He slept happily that night, thinking of the pair of shoes he would make the next day. In the morning, after he had a slice of toast for breakfast, he entered his workroom. So the previous night, he had made all the preparations to make a pair of shoes in the next morning. So the next morning, he wakes up after a good night's sleep. Then he had a humble breakfast and he enters his workroom. What for? To start making the shoes. And then what he sees? Let's see. On his work table stood a beautiful pair of fancy shoes. So this shoemaker enters his workroom and on his work table he sees a pair of beautiful fancy shoes. The shoemaker was completely taken aback. Taken aback means very surprised. So seeing this pair of shoes, he got very surprised. He didn't know who did this for him. He just came to the workroom to make the shoes, but there he sees a beautiful pair of shoes already kept on the work table. He rushed to call his wife. When he told her what he had seen, she could not believe him. So in that amazement, he calls his wife and shows her the beautiful pair of shoes. And she could not just believe him. She could not understand what was happening. Now, the shoemaker took the shoes in his hands, admiring the neat and tidy stitches. He had tears in his eyes. He thanked God for this miracle and set the pair on the window shelf. So he couldn't believe his eyes. He was surprised to see how neatly the shoes were stitched. And he could not believe this miracle, and he thanked God for this great help. And what did he do next? He put up these shoes on the window of his shop. Then what happened next? Let's see. A rich merchant was passing by the shoemaker's window. When he spotted the attractive pair of shoes, he went inside and bought them, paying a handsome price. So what happens? So a rich merchant was passing by the shoemaker's shop, and he sees this beautiful pair of fancy shoes, and he decides to buy these shoes. And he buys these shoes from the shoemaker at a very good price. After such a long time, the shoemaker and his wife had a proper meal that day. So he got enough money, the shoemaker got enough money to buy things for a proper meal. Most of the days they were only having a piece of bread. But today he got a good business and he could buy enough food for them. That evening, the shoemaker bought enough leather to make 2 pairs of shoes. He cut and shaped the shoes with great love and care. So since he got enough money, he bought more leather, which is enough to make 2 pair of shoes. And he made all the preparations for the next day to make the shoes. By the end of the evening, he was tired. He laid everything out and left the room. So he made all the preparations and kept everything on his work table and left the room. He thought that he would come back the next morning to complete the work. So that's his habit. So the shoemaker usually make all the preparations the previous night, and then he'll start making the shoes the next day. The next morning, the shoemaker woke up early. He bathed and prayed, ate his humble breakfast, and then stepped into the room where he worked. Lo and behold, once again he found 2 stylish pairs of shoes waiting for him on his work table. So what happened? The next morning he wakes up and he says all his prayers, and he did all the routine, and he had a humble breakfast. He goes to his workroom, and what he sees there? To his amazement, he sees 2 pairs of stylish shoes sitting there on the work table. He was astonished to see this. With a prayer on his lips and a tear in his eye, the shoemaker once again thanked God for this fortune. That day, 2 more rich clients bought the shoes at a very good price. Again, the shoemaker bought more leather and left it in the room. The next day, he found 4 pairs of attractive new shoes on his work table, and this went on for some time. So what happened? When he comes to his workroom, he saw this 2 beautiful pairs of shoes which were kept on his work table. He was so happy and he was so astonished to see this. He thanked God for this miracle, and with the money that he got after selling those shoes, he bought leather again, just enough to make 4 pairs of shoes. And then more clients came to him. His business started growing, and this went on for some time. So he buys leather and make all the preparations for making the shoes, and he'll keep it on his work table at night. Then he goes to sleep, and the next morning he'll see beautiful pairs of shoes being kept on his work table. And this went on happening. Soon the shoemaker became quite rich. He could buy lots of leather and make many pairs of shoes at once. Before Christmas, the shoemaker's wife suggested they find out who was helping them with the shoes that night. So what did they do? So the couple, the husband and the wife, the shoemaker and his wife, hid behind the curtain of the workroom and stood in absolute silence. They were hiding behind the curtain to see who were coming at night to help them make the shoes. So right after midnight, the window opened and 2 small elves entered the rooms. So who came in the room? Right after midnight, the window of the workroom opened and 2 small elves came to the room. They entered the rooms. They were dressed in dirty and torn clothes. So what were they wearing? Were they wearing splendid and grand clothes? No. They were wearing dirty and torn clothes. They sang and hummed to themselves and worked on the pieces of leather that were sitting on the table. So they were really enjoying the work they were doing. They were singing to themselves, humming songs, and they were making shoes, stitching and cutting the leather to make the shoes for the shoemaker. The shoemaker and his wife were so grateful that they nearly came out of their hiding place and thanked them. But they did not move so as not to scare the elves. So the shoemaker and his wife were so happy to see the elves, and they badly wanted to go near the elves and thank them, but they were scared that they are going to scare the elves. So they did not go near the elves. They just stood there and watched the elves making the shoes. The next day, the shoemaker and his wife cut bits of cloth and made little clothes for the elves. So they have seen the elves making the shoes for them, and what happened the next day? The next day, the shoemaker and his wife cut bits of cloth and made little clothes for the elves. The next day, the shoemaker and his wife cut bits of cloth and made little beautiful dresses for the elves, because they have seen that the elves were wearing dirty and torn clothes. The shoemaker and his wife wanted to do something in return for the elves for the great help they were doing to them. So they made these tiny little dresses for the elves and kept it on the work table of the workroom. Let's see what happened next. That night, they put the new clothes on the work table and left the room. After a while, the elves came, as usual, looking for the pieces of leather that the shoemaker would have left behind. But instead, they found 2 new sets of clothes for themselves. The elves were extremely happy. So as usual, the elves entered the workroom after midnight, and they were looking for the piece of leather kept on the work table. But instead, what did they see? They saw these tiny beautiful clothes being kept for the elves. When they got these new clothes, they were extremely happy. And they took the clothes and jumped through the window, singing and dancing merrily. The shoemaker and his wife thanked them silently. So they took these new clothes and they went back through the window. The shoemaker now had enough money and he could employ a few men to work for him. He was never poor again. So now that the shoemaker's business has grown, now that he is flourished, he is never poor again. And now he is able to employ a few men to help him with the business. Though the elves never came back, the shoemaker and his wife knew they were somewhere helping other poor people. So after that night, the elves never came to them back. The elves knew that now it's time for them to leave. The shoemaker is now rich and flourished, and he can employ other men to help him with the business. Even though the shoemaker and the wife never saw the elves again, they always thought about them and kept them in their prayers. They knew the elves were somewhere else helping other poor people in need. So children, helping others is a good thing to do, right? It makes everyone happy and it helps build a happier society. I hope you really enjoyed the story and you can read more and more fairy tales. Now, as a homework, there is an activity given in the Do and Learn page, which is page number 78. You can see an activity described there about making sock puppets. I'm sure you are going to really enjoy this one. Now, you can make your own sock puppets following the instructions described there, and then you can take a picture and send us to Teams. So that's all for today, children. We will meet in the next class. Till then, bye.